Department of Anthropology. This is one of the lecture series, one of the lecture series that has been organized by Department of Anthropology for the last more than a year. Today we are having Professor Dr. Mary Catherine Shenk, and I'm honored that I'm going to introduce Dr. Shenk to you guys. Before initiating the entire process, entire program, I would like to request Professor Subroto Shankar Bakchi, our departmental head, and our distinguished speaker, Dr. Shenk, please come to the dais. And we have a very small and formal felicitation to you, ma'am. Please come. I would like to request today's chair, Professor S.S. Bakchi, to give me kind permission to process the entire program.
All kinds of permission.
Thank you. So I would like to request Paramita help sir to give Uttorio and memento for felicitation, and of course a flower bouquet. Please. A round of applause, please.
Okay.
From the audience. Thank you. And a small flower bouquet. And a token of gift and a felicitation. Thank you. It's a very formal and very serious discussion. Dr. Shenk, when I made Dr. Shenk introduce myself as a Shubhendu, and she asked me, Namaskar, kemon achen? So I was overwhelmed. Thank you, Dr. Shenk, to come here and present this seminar to our students and us as well. Before initiating the entire process, I would like to introduce formally Dr. Shenk. Dr. Shenk is now an associate professor in Penn State University. She is basically a biocultural anthropologist, human behavioral ecologist, anthropological demographer with interest in marriage, family, kinship, parental investment, fertility, mortality, and inequality. She have conducted field research on the economics on marriage, parental investment in urban South India. Nowadays, she is working in Pakistan as well as she has worked in Bangladesh as well. Of course, Professor Dr. Shenk's CV is an illustrious CV. I can't read and can't just go through the entire CV, but still, when I do some research on Dr. Shenk's research career, it's really a illustrious one. She has earned number of grants and fellowships as well. She has won National Science Foundation Seniors Research Award. She has also owned University Missouri Research Board grant, Missouri Research Council grant, in NESC Working Group grant, Research Team Short Seminar grant, National Science Foundation Senior Research Award, and so on. The list is so big now. She has done his PhD in anthropology from the University of Washington, Seattle, Washington. She is now primarily associated with an associate professor of anthropology and demography in the Department of Anthropology and graduate program in demography in Pennsylvania State University. Before that, she was associated with University of Missouri and other departments as well. If I go to the research interest, which is very important for today's lecture, uh, I must brief in a very short way the three different domains she is working on. The first one, the evolution of equality and social complexity, the evolutionary demography of human fertility, and the last one is kinship, marriage, and family system in evolutionary perspective. As far the student is concerned of this department, you know that anthropological demography is one of the uh, multi-dimensional subject in biological anthropology, not only biological anthropology, but in anthropology. And it can run both the ways. It can create a huge impact in the subject of anthropology as well as to understand the evolution and the demographic dynamics of a society. With this very brief note and with this very brief introduction, again, I would like to welcome Dr. Shenk for today's speech. And now, before initiating your speech, ma'am, I would like to request our chair and B.R. Ambedkar Chair Professor, Departmental Head, Professor Subrata Shankar Bagchi, to say a few words regarding this lecture. Sir.
Thank you, Shubhendu, for this excellent introduction of Dr. Shenk. After that introduction, nothing is left for me to say. And I know that you are eagerly waiting for Dr. Shenk's speech. So I won't stand between you and Dr. Shenk. I hope and I am sure and definite that the speech will be delightful one and absorbing one. And of course, consanguinity is a worldwide feature, worldwide criteria. I mean, there are so many countries. She has took Pakistan, for example, for this lecture as one of the most frequently happening cross-cousin marriages and consanguinity in the world. And I mean, there are so many groups in India. As a social anthropologist, I know communities in India, tribal people, very much practice the consanguinity. So, from social anthropological point of view and from anthropological point of view, it would be very interesting for me to listen to this speech, and I can tell you that I will listen with rapt attention. And we are actually organizing few special lectures. You are quite, we could witness that. Recently we had organized lectures on decolonizing UK syllabi. We also organized a few lectures, and we're going to organize a very famous lecture by a famous anthropologist, Professor Partha Chatterjee, on February 8th, on 100 years of anthropology in India. So I hope this series would be a successful one, and we are documenting this series. I hope some publications can happen. Also request Dr. Shenk, if you can give us the write-up, so we can publish it as a collection of lecture series up until here. So this is my request. Of course, I know that she is not prepared, possibly with the write-up, and maybe you can send it later to us. Thank you, and I'm well and truly happy, proud that we could host Dr. Shenk in our department for a very good lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bagchi. Before initiating the main program, today's special lecture is basically based on consanguinity, kinship, ecology and development, why Pakistan has the highest rates of cousin marriage in the modern world. So before initiating the main program, I would like to welcome formally all distinguished professors from our department, especially Professor Orbratan Moy Banerjee, Bandyopadhyay, sir, Professor Shubho Roy, Dr. Shubhamoy Kishku, Professor Dr. Shutopa Chaudhary Madam, and there are lots of professors from colleges. We are all welcome to you, all the students, professors from colleges, distinguished guests, as well as, thank you sir for remembering me, online, those are on online with us. We are welcoming all the guests, both in physical over here as well as online. Last but not the least, the enter this today's program, Dr. Shashwata Ghosh is the only one. Because of the guy, we are actually having Dr. Shenk. So Shashwata for me, he Shashwata. Welcome Shashwata to our department, and thank you for nice introduction, Dr. Shenk, to our department. Thank you. Now the lecture will be start. Ma'am, please.
মাত্র এইখানকার সাউন্ডটা তো অন নেই, ওইখানকার সাউন্ডটা অন নেই, সাউন্ড ওখান থেকে ক্যাপচার হচ্ছে, না এরা অনলাইন যারা আছে তারা শুনতে পাচ্ছে, তারা শুনতে পাচ্ছে। হ্যাঁ
Is it live?
এটা ইয়ে করা যাবে না, কোনেক্টটা না ওটা করা যাবে না।
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much to everyone for this really warm welcome here. I'm very interested to visit this department for a long time because it is one of the oldest anthropology departments in the country. I was told today it is the oldest, and also because it is a department where there's a long history of biological anthropology and anthropological demography. So for me, these are interesting features of this department. While he's doing that, I'll just introduce myself a little bit. Okay. So today I want to discuss a paper that is written, but we are just now sending it out for publication with two colleagues. My colleague Saman Nas, who is finished her PhD recently from Penn State in health policy administration and demography, and Teresa Chaudhary, who's at the Lahore School of Economics and collected this data. But the background of this is I have been working in South Asia for the last 20 years, first on economics of marriage in Bangalore 20 years back, and then since then in Bangladesh on fertility transition and economic development and lots of topics. And now I am again coming back to India to work in West Bengal and Bangladesh, comparative study, focusing on fertility and child outcomes, but interested in religion and religiosity. But I have a lot of data and a lot of interest. So in discussing today, I want to set the stage by saying one thing that connects my interests together is the topic of economic development and social change. So coming to India 20 years ago and being in this region for a long time, one thing that was very obvious to me, and of course focused on by many people and anthropologists here in India, is the question of what is happening with social change in the recent past now, in contemporary India. And some of the things I've been interested in are changed to the present, but maybe for the last 50 years or 100 years, studying things like what is happening with economics of marriage, what is happening with dowry, things like this. One of those topics, of course, is cousin marriage. Like, I became interested in this more in Bangladesh, but I think the transitions in health and fertility are very, very well studied, in not just in anthropology, but outside of the field. But transitions in marriage and kinship systems, they're also studied, but maybe in the US we see that less. So the studies are happening here, but that information is not as obvious outside. So I became really interested in studying how and why these changes are happening. And in my perspective, I think the change that is happening with economic development, with what we sometimes call market integration in the recent literature, in anthropology, is probably as profound a transition as the transition from agriculture to agriculture from foraging long years back, depending on where you are. And so I'm interested in, that is kind of the perspective I'm taking when I'm thinking about these kinds of things. But given that, in my research I've focused mainly on two kinds of shifts that are happening with economic development in modern South Asia. And one is this change towards lower fertility and higher parental investment. We know this as the demographic transition. I have also studied changes in marriage and marriage payments that are happening in this region that are actually related, I think, to what's happening with fertility. I could show you some data on that in a different talk. But today I want to discuss the other change that is happening that I've been interested in, which is a change from intensive to extensive kin relationships. And maybe you haven't heard those terms before, but this is a concept, I think when I explain it, it will be more clear to you, for those of you, because of your background in anthropology. So, another reason to give this presentation at this university is that people have studied consanguinity in this department for a long time. So many of you are aware of those kinds of studies, you may have read those things, discussed those things in courses. But this is a commonly used graphic of the world, focusing on the proportion of consanguineous marriages, and you can see percent there. And we can see that North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of South Asia are the main areas in the world that you see consanguinity in the modern world. But we all know that in the past, cousin marriage and cross-cousin marriage were extremely common cross-culturally in most parts of the world, and that has probably changed in many parts of the world only in the last few centuries. So today, I want to try to answer this question of why Pakistan has the highest rates of cousin marriage in the modern world by a fairly large margin. So these are the rates from DHS data from 1990 through 2017, 2018. And you can see that around 50% of people are married to first cousins. And then another 8 to 10% of people are married to other relatives, mainly second cousins. So for a total, we are talking about almost 60% of the population married to cousins and 50% to first cousins. These are very high rates for the modern world. However, they're not that uncommon in other parts of the world and weren't in the past. But in order to get here, I want to start by kind of giving you further background. One thing I want to say is that I'm not today going to talk about health impacts of consanguinity. That has been studied, including in this department. But there's a lot of arguments about whether or not you should see very, very significant health effects or not. But suffice it to say, while you do see health effects of consanguinity, they are frequently not so bad that they will prevent people from marrying their cousins. So you see in most parts of the world, or many parts of the world historically, common bit louder? Okay, all right. In most parts of the world, you see lots of people marrying their cousins in the past. And so, despite effects that may have existed on child health, and so the question from my side is more of a social anthropological, demographic anthropological question of why do people marry their cousins? And how does economic development affect that? So, I'll start with the first question first, based on some of my previous work and some other work in the literature. So in 2016, I worked with some colleagues to publish a paper on consanguineous marriages, kinship ecology, and market transition in current anthropology. And these are some papers from my field site in Mapla, Bangladesh, where I have been working for 15 years now. So when we had collected the data, and I was trying to analyze the data, and then I started reading some recent work on reasons for cousin marriage, especially in the behavioral ecology and evolutionary literature. And I came across some papers. One of them is actually my colleague at the time, Robert Walker, when I was at the University of Missouri, who argued for a trade-off in marriage decisions between expanding social networks or the extensive kinship pattern, or reinforcing existing kin ties, or what we call an intensive kin pattern. As you know, these are old themes in anthropology, but kind of repackaged in a particular way. So they argue in their papers that hunter-gatherers, who are the interest of my colleague Dr. Walker, emphasize extensive kinship, meaning broad kin ties outside their kin network, to try to expand their social network and have relatively low rates of kin marriage. But they said that non-foragers, so cultures who are pastoralists or agriculturalists, emphasize intensive kinship in many cases, where you're trying to reinforce existing kin ties, often related to keeping property together or other kinds of motivations, and thus in some cases have relatively high rates of kin marriage. And they found, comparing across a lot of cultures, that you may have more surviving children under intensive kinship in some of these non-foraging kinship systems, subsistence systems, and because of this, you would have a direct motivation to continue the pattern. And so from their paper, they make an argument comparing extensive and intensive kinship across foragers and non-foragers. And then in our paper in 2016, we do the same thing, but we add instead a focus on market economies. So we are comparing hunter-gatherers to agricultural societies and then to market economies. And I'll just put the main comparison here so it's clearer to read. So the argument here is that in market economic systems, you have the reemergence of motivations for broader kin ties. I'll talk about this in a minute. So we might see, what we see in the real world is that you have many kin marriages, especially in traditional agricultural contexts, where you have relatively few in market economies. In traditional, mainly agricultural contexts, you often have marriage distances close. People marry someone in the same village or a nearby village within the same district. Whereas in market economies, you see a shift to people marrying people who are at a far distance from them, maybe from different states or even different countries. You see a focus on endogamy, different kinds of endogamy, especially here, for example, by caste, by religion, in agricultural contexts, whereas in market economic contexts, you see a focus on exogamy in terms of kin, but endogamy in terms of social class. You also see a shift from marriage as being usually arranged to rarely or more rarely arranged. And you see a shift from extended family structures to nuclear family structures, and from postmarital residence with the parents or in-laws to neolocal residence separately from in-laws or parents. So I think I'm interested in this topic, and we did some qualitative and also quantitative work in my field site in Bangladesh. And I just want to show you the results of the qualitative piece of this topic, just to give you a sense. This is some background on the research that we have done there. But I'm going to focus now on this 42 semi-structured interviews and a couple of focus groups we did on kin marriage practices in 2014. Basically, if I want to summarize, what we found that people would say in these qualitative discussions was this. Marriage in la chachato Bible, this is patrilineal parallel cousins. Here you would say what? Kaka, this is your father's brothers, children, right? Kaka. Kakato Bible, huh? Right. In the Kakato Bible. Kurtoto. This is one of the things I know the kin terms are different, but I haven't yet learned the West Bengal kin terms yet. So in this, the father's brother's children, these marriages were usually related to property, trying to keep the rights to the property in the family, usually land. Marriage in what they call the Kalato Paibon, but that would be your Mashi, right? Mashtoto. But Pishtoto will be in my next point. So this is Mashtoto, only Mashtoto here, right? Okay. In the matrilineal parallel cousins, these marriages were almost always related to love. Because in the Bangladeshi context, you were not raised with those people. They were living Baire, right? They were living far from you, Ektudur. And so they visited you, that was like a stranger to you, but you were allowed to mix with them because they're your cousins. So you have a lot of people falling in love with their matrilateral parallel cousins and getting married. And the family may allow to arrange the match because of the cousin relationship. And we found if it was what they would say mamatu fufato baibon, but basically it is mamato, mamat, and then pistoto, mamato, pistoto, baibon, here. You would have, instead, there were lots of different reasons for marriages. This is mostly in a Muslim context, but even in Hindus, we saw a few marriages with cousins. Mostly love marriages, but not very many. Okay. So people would also mention reasons like liking the bride and groom, meaning the parents liked that girl and they wanted their son to marry that girl. They want to maintain the family relationships. Of course, you're familiar with this. They need a helpful daughter-in-law. They want a helpful daughter-in-law. They think a cousin will be more helpful. Or sometimes they're trying to match or sort of mating. I think many of you know the term. They're trying to match on social status. However, what was probably even more interesting to me, thinking about that intensive, extensive kinship idea I just mentioned to you, was that when we were in the field, when we asked people, just open-ended question, why would you not want to marry a relative, or why would you not want your children to marry a relative? 65% of respondents just said immediately that they want to make new relatives. That was the main goal, was to make new relatives, which is exactly the argument about extensive kinship system. That in an extensive kinship system, you want to make new relatives through marriage, that because those relatives can help you in some way. In this context, in Bangladesh, people would tell us, well, they can help us get a job in the city. They can help us get a good educational situation. They are earning in a different industry, in a different place. So if we are having problems, they will not be having problems. So trying essentially to diversify socially and economically through marriage. So the point is making new relatives. So to me, this is one of the few, maybe 5 or 6 times in my career when we're in the field and we're hearing something and they're telling you exactly the answer to the question. And then you have to think about how you explain it in a theoretical way. So other topics that people raised were that new relatives were easier to negotiate with for marriage payments or other things without breaking the family relationship. With kin, you would have to keep quiet if there was some problem. They also said there are relatively egalitarian relationships with their kin, and if there was a marriage, there was an inequality that was introduced because the groom's family was, ektu upore, the bride's family, right? That was associated with demands or any kind of economics that might come in. And then people also emphasize the fourth one, and I want to call your attention to this here because it comes up again in this talk. They would emphasize the lack of available relatives. There are no cousins. So there are no cousins, period, for marriage, or those cousins are not good. They're not a good match for us, economically, or in terms of reputation or something. So they're avoiding marriage to cousins because there aren't cousins, or because those cousins are not a good match for other reasons. All right. So now I want to move to the main, if you want to read that paper, it's been published a few years, you can see the whole details. I know at least a couple of you have read it, right? But now I want to move on to something that is not published. It's new information, new data, new analysis. We are about to submit it very soon. I'll show you the results here. So again, I want to remind you of what's going on in cousin marriage in Pakistan. We have 50% of people married to their first cousins, almost 60% of first and second cousins, and what is happening over time? Basically, nothing is happening over time. Data from 2017-2018 shows almost as many people married to cousins as were married to their cousins 30 years back. Or even before that, we have less good data from then. So this is not changing. Or at least it's not changing yet or very quickly. However, I think many of you are probably aware that in most other places in the world, what is happening to the rate of cousin marriage? In economically developed contexts or developing contexts, it's going down. So the question here is, why are these rates so high and why are they remaining so high? So if you review the literature, and we review it in that previous paper on Bangladesh, but also you can look at the data on Pakistan also, you see that this literature focuses on three main reasons for cousin marriage, or the changes in cousin marriage with economic development. So one is that they think economic development should... Okay.
It's all right.
Oh, that does.
ইন্টারনেট চলে নেট আছে
It's recurring.
আচ্ছা
It's trying to recur.
এমনিতে নেট আছে ইন্টারনেট পেয়েছে
Just make an announcement that there is a problem with network. We'll join. The lecture will start shortly. If you, Pranjal, you can make the announcement. Yeah. No, we are starting.
জাস্ট লিখে দে সরি ফর ইনকনভিনিয়েন্স
ছবিটা কি এদার ওদার করে দাও পড়াটা পড়া যাচ্ছে যাবে কি না ঠিক আছে পুরো পড়া দেখা হবে
All right, I'll go ahead and restart. There were some technical issues, but hopefully we'll be back now. If you review this literature, what you see is that most people argue that economic development should decrease the rates of cousin marriage, both for the reasons we think of, which I've discussed a little bit with extensive kinship, wanting to make new relatives, but also most of the literature says that people are interested in, they move to the city, they lose touch with their relatives, they want to have more modern lifestyles, they have a lot of motivations. They go to school, they meet new people in school who are different than the people who they would have originally married. So usually people think economic development should be associated with a reduction in the rate of cousin marriage. A lot of the literature also focuses on cultural norms, arguing that if you're in a community that has cultural norms that strongly support cousin marriage, this will make your likelihood of having cousin marriage higher. And so one of the ways this is frequently studied is by looking at the parents, whether the parents have cousin marriages or not, and some other social norms as well. And then finally, you'll also see literature focusing on marriage payments, and especially in South Asia on dowry, with an argument that some people may want to marry cousins to avoid paying large dowries, right? Certainly, qualitatively, people will tell you this, and some of the literature also says this. So we are going to look and see if any of these things are happening in the Pakistani context. So first we're going to look at what drives cousin marriages in Pakistan with the data set. Then we're going to look at the second question, comparing Pakistan to some other places to see about why Pakistan has such high rates of cousin marriage. Okay, so the data we're using here is from the Punjab Consanguinity survey, which data was collected in 2009 by my colleague Teresa Chowdhury at the Lahore School of Economics. So they take the state of Punjab in Pakistan and they do a 3-stage clustered random sampling where they take a certain number of sub-districts, then villages, and then individuals within villages. And I can show you some details later if you want. The sample size we're using is 1,000 couples, 1,011. And the thing that is good about this survey that's very useful is Teresa reached out to me after reading my other paper to try to work with me on analyzing this data because she has very, very detailed data on cousin marriages, which the Bangladesh DHS data, which many people use, or the NFHS data here in India that many people use for demographic research do not have. And because they're not able to do quite such fine-grained analysis because they don't have that level of data. I'll show you some of those. We're going to do an analysis with multiple imputation to fill in some gaps in the data. There aren't too many. And then we'll show you the Pakistan Demographic and Health Survey data a couple of times, just to say a few comparative pieces of information. So one of the reasons why we think it's more ideal to use this data set than DHS data is if you look at the DHS data for Pakistan, and then you compare it to the Punjab Consanguinity survey for Pakistan, you can see that the rates of first cousin and second cousin marriage look different. And we're pretty sure that they look different because in the Pakistan DHS data, they don't ask quite in as much detail about the exact relationship between the cousins. So a lot of times they're assuming it's the first cousin or not actually asking for the kin terms to truly understand the relationship. Whereas in this Punjab Consanguinity survey, they ask in detail about the exact relationship. And so we think there's a better level of understanding of exactly what's happening. What we find here is a very similar rate of cousin marriage, about 60%, but only about 40% are first cousins and the rest are second cousins, which is a little bit more realistic than 50% being first cousins. All right, I want to show you now the results, qualitative and quantitative results. This is a mixed methods project. on what factors drive cousin marriage within Pakistan, or at least what are associated with it in Pakistan. If you're, I don't know the background here, you don't need to know all this kind of thing. We're doing logistic regression. So you bivariate outcome variable. We're predicting who marries a cousin. If you marry a cousin, you have a 1. If you didn't marry a cousin, it is a 0 for that marriage, right? We have 4 groups of variables. One is the basic demographics. The second one is economic factors, then cultural factors, then dowry or marriage-related factors. I'll show you all of those results separately, but they're in the model at the same time. And then we'll also look at the walima, or husband's expenditure on the wedding, at the end as well. Okay. These are just some descriptives. I'll just point out a couple of things for you so that you understand what's happening in this. So marriage to any cousin in this data set, 643 of the people interviewed had married cousins. So that's about 63%, which means this is just in line with the rest of Pakistan. And the rest of the people had married someone who is not a cousin, not for a second cousin or any relative. We have some data on which cousins they've married, but as you can see in that second set, people marry all sorts of different cousins. This is a Muslim community in which any cousin is fine for marriage. In many places in the world, cross cousins would be preferred for marriage, as many of you know, or in the Middle East, patrilateral parallel cousins. But in this context, all cousins are allowed. And we also have some people who are married a few other relatives as well. So you can see those details. You can also see in this context, we have mostly arranged marriages. Some are arranged love marriages, in which the bride and groom themselves have arranged, the parents have agreed. A few proper love marriages where they have gone outside of their parents. And then we have marriages that are going across the different years of the whole, starting before 1980 and going through up to 2009. We have marriages from the whole period of time. We are controlling for cohort here. And then wives and husbands, mainly were in their late 30s or 40s. And obviously, husbands are a bit older than their wives in this context and most contexts. Okay, alongside the kind of more statistical analysis, I'm just going to show you some basic results from, they did a small kind of qualitative section where they coded responses. And this is what they find. Let's ask the same questions that we ask in Bangladesh. In this case, it's why did you marry your cousin? Instead of why would you marry a cousin, why did you marry a cousin? And this is what they find. That in most cases, their main motivation is that the parents have arranged the marriage, or maybe that the grandparents have arranged the marriage. And next, most commonly, though not commonly, we see the same thing we see in Bangladesh, is that some of these cousin marriages are love marriages. And then all other cases, they're really saying, okay, there's something else going on. There's no proposal, so we had to arrange the marriage with a cousin. We couldn't afford a dowry payment for an outsider. There's other concerns, but they seem very uncommon. Most people here, the focus is on arranged marriage. And it was the parents' choice and wish that they marry a cousin. However, if you ask, why did you not marry a first cousin? You get slightly different responses. One, that they found a better match than cousins, usually for socioeconomic reasons when you see the details of this. Secondly, that no cousin was available, right? And third, it's kind of a combination. None of the available cousins were good enough. It's sort of there's a better match, but the cousins are not very appealing as marriage partners to their parents or to the children themselves. And a few people say things like it's not right or their health outcomes or something like this, but this is rare. Mostly people have other concerns. All right. I'm now going to show you the results of our quantitative, the statistical analysis. I have 4 parts, but again, these are all in the model together. So these things are adjusted. The first thing I think you can see is that there's no statistically significant difference between arranged and love marriage on whether or not you marry a cousin. It looks like arranged love, maybe love marriage people are less likely to marry cousins, but this is not significant, so these are not necessarily meaningful results. We do show a trend over time towards a lower likelihood towards marrying cousins, but again, it's not significant, so we're not sure that that's really driving very much. Where we do see really clear results here is in the number of cousins that people have. So if you have more cousins on the wife's side or more cousins on the husband's side, you are more likely to marry a cousin. Which seems obvious and may be boring, but I have to tell you, is almost nowhere in this literature that people point out this basic demographic fact. So it's one of the things that we are interested in these results. Also, this kind of variable, almost no one has the data on how many cousins people have, and because of that, they can't do the analysis. But it's a very clear, one of the strongest relationships that we have in this data. Another thing that we see here is that if you, as a wife, this is similar for the husband, you have a smaller number of siblings, you're more likely to marry a cousin. Another way of saying that is that if you have more siblings, you're less likely to marry a cousin. We think that one of the reasons this is possibly true is that there's only a certain number of potential cousins that are out there. So if your older sister has already married a cousin, the chances that you would have a cousin to marry or that your parents would care about marrying a cousin is lower. You already have that connection made between the two families. The cousin is less likely to be there, and the need for a cousin marriage or connection between the families is also less. Let's look at the results for economic factors now. There is no clear result for the education of the wife. We looked at this in a variety of ways. There's no significant effect on this. But there is a significant effect on two aspects of education. They both have to do with husbands. One is that more educated husbands are less likely to have cousin marriages. And also, if the husband attended a coeducational institution, he's less likely to have a cousin marriage. Again, this is probably not surprising to anyone here. Where do people mostly find their spouses if they don't have an arranged marriage? In South Asia. They frequently find them in school, right? Exactly. In college, something like this, in university. So you see this kind of pattern also in this context. We also have an interesting and somewhat counterintuitive finding that was very durable, that if the wife owns more of the household assets, she's more likely to be married to a cousin. So talking to my colleagues about this and discussing it in the paper, we think the most likely explanation for this is that if women have a bunch of resources, their family may be trying to protect them by marrying them to a cousin in some cases. That may not always be true, though. We don't have much effect of a husband's occupation, even directly, in bivariate results. In terms of cultural factors, or what most people analyze in the literature as cultural factors, or at least traditions, whether if the wife's parents or the husband's parents had a consanguineous marriage, or cousin marriage, they are much more likely that you were married to a cousin also, right? That makes sense? We also see, in terms of where people lived before marriage, the closer you live, living in the same village, you're more likely to marry a cousin, and the more distantly you live, the less likely you are to marry a cousin. This is again quite consistent with that pattern that we were discussing from extensive and intensive kinship. If there's some social norm in the family that you have to marry someone from a specific caste or clan, If the family is emphasizing that, you also see this rate of cousin marriage is higher. All right, show you the last set of results, and then we can discuss this a little bit. The next question. We don't find particularly interesting results for dowry. I don't have any direct evidence that paying a dowry or the size of the dowry is associated with people marrying cousins. This is despite the fact that in many places in South Asia, including in Bangladesh where I work, there's qualitative and sometimes quantitative evidence that dowries are less if you marry your cousin, and that is a motivation for cousin marriage. But in this Pakistani context, we don't see that. However, we do see something else, which is the payments from the groom's side. So payments for the walima, big event hosted by the groom's side. I also have data on this from Bangalore 20 years ago. I have to reanalyze for this reason. But groom's families that spend a lot on the walima, which usually means that the marriage is either with a high status family, that the bride status family is high status, that the groom's family is high status, or that the marriage is very politically important to the families, was associated with a lower likelihood of marrying cousins. So very high expenditures from the groom's side were made in cases of marrying outside, right? Marrying outside of the kin group. But only in cases of very high expenditures. And it's not just driven by one or two people, but it does seem to be driven by a group of people who have high payments. Okay, so let's summarize some of these findings. The factors that are increasing the likelihood of cousin marriage, more associated with cousin marriage, more likelihood of marrying your cousin. Large social networks of cousins, obvious but very understudied. Arranged marriage, again, not surprising. Consanguinity of the parents' marriages. Marrying someone in close geographic proximity. And goals of restricting marriage to within a caste or a clan. So some of these we could think of as cultural norms, and some of these we could think of as more kind of availability of cousins. On the other hand, factors that are reducing the likelihood of cousin marriage, making it less likely that you marry your cousin, would include more educated husbands, husbands who went to coeducational institutions. We do not see the same pattern for wives, but there is less variation in women's education. Thus, we'd be less likely to see variation on this point than we would for husbands, because husbands have more variation. Greater distance between the natal homes of spouses, so you're marrying someone from maybe a different community. Less pressure from the family for endogamous marriage, and high expenditures on the wedding from the groom's side. In general, these factors are consistent with much, not all, of the existing literature that we see that economic development and is associated with lower rates of cousin marriage, and traditional cultural factors are associated with high rates, but it's not consistent with the existing literature on dowry. It's also consistent, I would argue, with at least some of the predictions from extensive and intensive kinship, but we'll get to that more in a second. In the last little while here, I want to discuss this last question of why does Pakistan have such high rates of cousin marriage? In an ideal world, I would have data from around the world that were similar to this, that would allow us to go into this in more detail. But I don't have this, and people have already analyzed some of the kind of national level data. But given this as a Pakistani data as a comparison case, I want to compare across two sets of comparisons to show what I think are some of the key differences between Pakistan and some other places that may be driving this. So one of them is a comparison between Pakistan and the other major countries in South Asia, so India and Bangladesh. With more space, we would break down parts of India, but we'll keep India as one here. You can see that the consanguinity rate in Pakistan is much, much, much higher, 57.9%, than it is in India at 9.3, or in Bangladesh at 17.6. I should also say rates of cousin marriage in Bangladesh are seemingly decreasing over time, as they are in much of the rest of the world. Many of these things we don't see particularly clear contrast with, but we see contrast, I think, in 2 or 3 areas. One is in gender and education. So you can see this point, gross enrollment ratio in secondary education, and the gross enrollment ratio in secondary education for females, so for girls, women. These rates are much higher in India and Bangladesh, and India and Bangladesh look a lot more similar than in Pakistan, where the rates are much lower, almost half, right? This is strikingly different. Here's some other things that are strikingly different. The total fertility rate in Pakistan at 3.6 is much higher than that in India or in Bangladesh. This is from a few years ago, 2.2, 2.3 in India, Bangladesh. As many of you know, in India, total fertility rate varies a lot from, 1.6 in West Bengal to 3 point something in, I forget, Bihar or some other places. They're really big differences, right? But on average, the fertility rates in India are kind of just above or at replacement rate. Same thing for Bangladesh, you see something similar. In Pakistan, however, has persistently high fertility, some of the higher persistently high fertility outside of sub-Saharan Africa. Percent Muslim, I want to point out here with percent Muslim that we have very sort of similar rates of being Muslim in Pakistan and Bangladesh as compared to India, but yet you see this really big contrast between what is happening in Bangladesh and what is happening in Pakistan. Okay, sorry, there's one more that I didn't highlight here that I want to highlight verbally. Just above the total fertility rate, you see population growth rate. You can see that the population growth rate in Pakistan is basically twice that of what you can see in India and Bangladesh. That high level of fertility and high population growth rate, why is that relevant here? Think about it. See if you can. Think about why it's relevant here. All right, I now want to compare Pakistan to the other countries in the world that have high rates of consanguineous marriage, over 30%. These countries are mostly in the Middle East and North Africa, also in Afghanistan. So again, that part of South Asia. You can see high rates of consanguinity in most of these countries, above 30%. But I want to again contrast the same variables I've already showed you. The total fertility rate in Pakistan and in several of the other countries is also high, above 3. And the 3 countries that have lower fertility rates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, I don't know how many of you have studied fertility transition, but those countries have undergone fertility decline very recently and very rapidly. So the number of small children is low now, but the number of people getting married 10 years ago was those children had been born in a higher fertility period of time. You can also see population growth rate here, something similar. If you look at the population growth rate, you can see even more clearly that the places with lower fertility still have relatively high population growth rates in some cases. Sorry. And I thought it was highlighted, but it's not highlighted here. You can also see a similar thing, that if you're looking at women's education, female literacy, etc., it's relatively low, except in the really rich countries in the Gulf that have recently gotten very high levels of education. Okay. So I want to conclude a few things from these analyses, and you can tell me if you agree, or you think I need to make other conclusions instead? So economic development seems to be associated with decreased likelihood of cousin marriage. Even in Pakistan, however, it's the rate of economic development may be slow enough that you're not seeing it. Certain kinds of economic development, especially as it's affecting women, may be slow enough that we're not seeing that yet. We also see this interesting thing that from a woman's financial perspective, non-cousin marriages were more likely to be marrying up, and cousin marriages were more likely to be marrying down, which is unusual. We also see traditional cultural factors are increased likelihood of cousin marriage, while modern cultural factors decreased it. In general, we see consistent results with the ideas, especially with the qualitative results, but also with some of the quantitative results that are consistent with the idea of people marrying out to give yourselves a more extensive kin experience, and marrying in, often in families that are trying to be more insular or trying to keep themselves separate. And then finally, I want to also emphasize this point that the global comparison especially shows the importance of high fertility and high rates of population growth in the maintenance of high rates of cousin marriage. This suggests that people stop marrying cousins in part in other parts of the world because they don't have cousins to marry. And so, for example, in Bangladesh, in some parts of India where cousin marriage was common in the past, if fertility has come down, and it's come down for a couple of generations, people are far less likely to have cousins to marry than they are in the past. And you can think about this by doing a kind of a mental exercise. If you think about if your parents are each one of 3 children, and we all know that in many parts of the world, your parents have many more siblings than that, certainly in rural Bangladesh and in rural India. You may be one of 1 or 2 children, but your parents were one of a larger subset. If you have on your side, on your father's side, 1 aunt and 1 uncle, and on your mother's side, 1 aunt and 1 uncle, and each one of them has 3 children, then I have 6 cousins on my mother's side and 6 cousins on my father's side. So I have 12 cousins. The likelihood that one of them will be the right gender and age for me to marry, there's a reasonable chance of that if I have also 3 siblings. But if we go to 2, then your mother only has 1 sibling, your father only has 1 sibling, you only have 3 cousins on one side, 3 cousins on the other side. It's a radical reduction, going from 3 to 2. So the number of cousins you have goes down really dramatically, going down from 3 to 2. And because of that, I think that this is, in some ways, an obvious demographic fact, but I think it's been underappreciated in the literature. You see only very few mentions about this sort of demographic shift. You see lots of focus in the literature on why people marry cousins. Many of those things, I think, are held up in these kinds of data, both qualitative and quantitative, but there's also something demographically going on that distinguishes the parts of the world that have high rates of cousin marriage now from the parts of the world that don't currently have high rates of cousin marriage, but may have in the past. All right. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Shenk. Now the floor is open for Q&A. If anybody has any questions, of course, we'll take one by one. I would like to request all the students to come up and participate in the question and answer sessions. Of course, we are starting with the question and answer session from professors and other distinguished speakers.
No, you can start with the scholars also. I appreciate it.
So thank you, Professor Roy. I'll come to you. Okay, so if anybody wants any questions to Dr. Shenk, please ask the questions. Anybody has any question regarding the lecture? Yeah.
Of course, why not?
Thank you, Dr. Shenk, for this delightful lecture. It's very interesting from the demographic perspective and also from the social cultural anthropological perspective. I'm Dr. Bhattacharya. I'm a social cultural anthropologist. I have a small comment like we have been speaking about consanguineal marriages and religion is a very important part of that. As we all know that consanguineal marriages or cousin marriages are prescribed in Muslim religion. And Bangladesh and Pakistan, they have the maximum Muslim population. So it is very a kind of prescribed kind of marriage format in their religion. So religion plays a major role in this kind of marriages. Because otherwise in our country, from the Hindu population, it is not a prescribed form of marriage. Because I have seen two cases where people get married in cousins and in Mastuto brothers and sisters, and they have been driven out from family and no kins kept any relationship with them. So it is not, this is prohibited in our religion, Hindu religion.
Part of- In North India, perhaps. In South India, cross-cousin marriages are quite
Yes,
common.
yes. And also with the maternal uncle and yeah, you know that. Ma'am, my query is small one. Like, have you noted any kind of like genetic disorders, disability? If these kind of cases are in families, are they still interested in cross cousins or parallel cousin marriage? And if there are twins, if my cousins are twins, is there kind of preference or something like, is these factors are playing any role? Genetic disorder, disability and twins. Are they playing any roles in kind of this kind of marriages? Have you noticed any kind of cases regarding that?
So in the, is it on? It's on, but it's not here. Okay, I'll try this one. So first of all, these patterns do vary by religion, but I think it's a kind of too simple to say it's just Hindu versus Muslim, because in Bangladesh and Pakistan, I mean, it is allowed to marry your cousin, but it's not actually like in many places, for example, in Bangladesh, people mostly don't prefer to marry their cousin, and they don't think there is a religious edict to marry their cousin. It's just like you can marry your cousin, but the norm is not actually that they should. This is a belief that exists outside, but like within Islam, it varies a lot whether or not they think it's so important to marry their cousin, or if they just think, okay, you can marry your cousin, but they don't frequently want to. So if I'm interviewing in people in Bangladesh, about 20% of people are married to cousins. Of those, in the younger generations, half of those are love marriages. So it's not like the religious prescription has very little to do with it, actually, in Bangladesh. In Pakistan, certainly religion has something to do with it. But my colleagues who are working there will basically say, you know, yes, I mean, we're allowed to marry our cousins, but everyone is marrying their cousins. It usually seems like what they're focusing on is more the practical aspects, right? Keeping land in the family, or just that it's the tradition of our culture we should marry cousins. But religion is not usually the primary thing that they're saying, right? It's something that is in the mix, but everyone is sort of Muslim in this Pakistani context. And in Bangladesh, in that study area, 90% of people are Muslim, and Hindus are there, but to come, right? So the question is, I mean, religion is associated, but then also if you think about Hindus in North India versus Hindus in the South, a lot of Hindus in the South are very, very orthodox in some ways, hyper-vegetarian, really observant of a lot of things, and yet traditionally in Dravidian kinship, right, you have this marriage of uncle-niece and cross-cousins. And in my data on marriage from my research in Bangalore 20 years ago, we have lots and lots of those cousin marriages, mostly in the older generation. But the cousin marriages are fading out in South India. They're fading out in Bangladesh, but they're not fading out in Pakistan. So it's not like I don't think religion has something to do with it, but I don't think you can say religion is, it's one of various factors, right? It's not the only factor. And comparing within religion, you see the variation within a religion is quite striking. The social norms, in North India and East India as well, right? There's a taboo against cousin marriage, as you're describing. But if you're in a small village in Tamil Nadu, right, no one's going to drive you out if you marry your cross cousin. If you marry your parallel cousin, maybe they will, right? But not if you marry your cross cousin. So I just want to point out those differences. Secondly, certainly we know there are health effects of cousin marriage, but this is a complicated literature because you can see health effects of cousin marriage. You can also see that they're much worse if people are in a close community marrying again and again. But then you also can see that the health effects are not necessarily so extreme, right? So that if people have some economic and social motivations to marry cousins, that factor, and especially if fertility is also high, it kind of, the motivation to marry cousins may be stronger than this kind of smaller risk. And so even in this area in Pakistan, I think you may have seen, I could go back and show you, but there have certainly been education campaigns and things like this in Pakistan because the rates of cousin marriage are so high that are saying there may be risks of cousin marriage, etc. So people are aware, some people are aware, but the number of people who are stating that they are aware of it or that they think it's important is kind of lower, right? The motivations seem to be, the social and other motivations seem to be stronger. In terms of twins, I'm not sure. I haven't heard anything with respect to twins specifically. Certainly, it's possible. I'd have to ask my colleague who collected this data herself. But in Bangladesh, also, I didn't hear anything. Like, no one says to me, oh, well, if we have someone who has a genetic disorder, then we definitely will avoid marrying. Maybe someone in Pakistan would say that because of the education campaigns. But in Bangladesh, certainly, when I was there, and you can read the transcripts and everything, and you just don't hear this as an important thing. They might mention it, but what do they mention first? We want to make new relatives. That is so much more important than any of these other kinds of considerations. So I think the social and socioeconomic motivations are really overriding these other kinds of concerns.
Anybody else? I think Professor Roy has some questions.
No, it's an observation.
Just wait.
Yeah, it's interesting that I was discussing with Shashwato and we found that, in Pakistan, the age at marriage is very high. And simultaneously, it is unlikely that if the age at marriage is low, the fertility is usually high. But here, age at marriage is high, simultaneously fertility rate is high. And more the fertility rate, what I presume that you are telling, that larger will be the sibling and more likely will be the cross cousin marriage. Because they will get the right pair. The likelihood will increase. The second interesting thing that I found that that is women's participation in workforce, which is significantly high from Pakistan if you go towards Bangladesh. That's the reason. That could be one of the reasons why that is a. Though you talked about extended kinship system, that is, they are more in your current anthropology paper. You talked about that extended. They want to extend their kinship, not the intensive kinship, but extended kinship, so that they can get many connections out of that, because they will increase the connectivity with to get facilities, different aspects. Second thing is very interesting that even family planning is higher compared from Pakistan compared to that. So it's a complex thing, altogether a complex thing. I think that there could be many reasons why Pakistan, despite Pakistan has a highest rate of consanguinity compared to another Islamic state, which is Bangladesh. And another, what I'm just trying to relate, I was discussing with you before the lecture that which one of my students who worked on a group of Muslim population of West Bengal, he also found that the contemporary generation, they are moving out, they are getting emancipated. At one point of time, this community was I mean, they remained intact. They didn't want to establish any contact with outside because they were a migrant group. So migrants always face a challenge with their identity. So nowadays, after 350 years, they are now moving out. The young generations, they are moving out, and they are actually preferring to marry outside the kin and cousin blood relations. And one interesting fact which they cited, that the present generation, there are a lot of breakups in the marriage. So divorce, separation, that actually is causing a distance between the kin's group. So that has become counterproductive these days, which they thought that it would be make them inclusive, to have a cohesive group, but rather it is becoming counterproductive. So there can be many reasons why in one group, or in one country, or in one group, or maybe one country rather to say, that where consanguinity is increasing. So there cannot be one truth. There are multiple truths, and each has to be judged from different socio-ecological, socio-political context. So thanks, wonderful talk. Thank you. I was just expecting some more qualitative data from you to understand the nuances of this one.
Any other observations or questions from students or as well as others?
Let me respond quickly to two things.
Yeah.
So thanks for that comment. The qualitative data from this Pakistan side is limited, right? And we can go back and collect more. We have more detailed data, qualitative data in Bangladesh, but I collected that whole sample myself, that qualitative, with my colleagues, my students, and some local research assistants, and also the quantitative data you have seen from the Bangladesh. We collected that ourselves. My colleague collected this Pakistan Consanguinity survey in 2009, but they have some qualitative work, but they don't have so extensively, and a lot of it is only transcribed into Punjabi, and so I have to get someone to make the transcripts into English, etc., to analyze it myself or to have a student analyze it. So we have some of that, but I think we need more as it's sort of helpful. One thing, you just brought up something at the end. I forgot what you said, but let me just say this. There is some literature out there, and we are not sure how to address it in this paper. There is some literature out there that associates kind of democracy, and that more democratic societies have lower rates of cousin marriage, or vice versa, right? That less democratic contexts have higher rates of cousin marriage. And people have made the argument that these large kin groups and the social networks that are kind of maintained through this intensive kinship practice of cousin marriage may kind of block democratic institutions, right, in those contexts. We are not sure we don't have data that's directly applicable to that. But if I showed it, I haven't mentioned it because I didn't want to go into so many details. But if you look at the democracy index scores for Pakistan versus India and Bangladesh, you'll see the same kind of pattern. Pakistan is like the democracy index is lower, and India and Bangladesh are kind of, look more democratic. And then you also see this in a lot of the states that have high levels of cousin marriage. But the challenge is still, if you don't have the cousins, you can't marry them, right? And so in a state like Bangladesh, right, which is kind of driving this is hard to know, because rates of cousin marriage in Bangladesh, we're still not as high as Pakistan, but they were higher than they are now. And so the fertility transition that has happened really dramatically in Bangladesh, and of course in West Bengal and South India, just has made it so that you can't really possibly marry your cousins. And so in South India, when I was asking about people marrying their cross cousins, Hindus marrying their cross cousins, people say, we don't want to do that anymore, it's kind of old fashioned, we don't agree, etc. But then other people would sometimes say, but we don't have any cousins anyway, right? So, but I wasn't giving any importance to that at the time because it seemed like a simple thing. But in reality, I think it's part of the explanation. But this I don't know what exactly to make of this democracy argument, but that argument is there in the literature. That seems to be connecting this sort of flexibility in the society. The argument is like if we are marrying outside and moving around socially, then we can more easily have and maintain a democratic society than if we are not. That's the argument. And my student from Pakistan, who's one of my co-authors, says that she feels like that's plausible to her. I don't know, but she thinks it's plausible.
But maybe one thing that maybe the overall cousin marriage, if you consider overall cousin marriage, let us not restrict on first cousin marriage. Maybe second cousin, third cousin. So if the intention is to marry a cousin, it may be first, second, third. So if the cousin marriage frequency remains intact or remains little altered, that indicates that fertility is not creating lower fertility is not creating much hindrance, because their custom or norms is getting preference, right? If they are not getting first cousin, they may be getting second cousin, maybe third cousin, because it's the cultural norm that you need to marry a cousin, whatever may be, first cousin, if not first cousin, then second, third. So this is again, I find it interesting. Since you are doing this, helping me with this national level data, may think of, whether this situation works or not.
Any other questions?
Ma'am, hello. I just want to know that is there any is there any possibility that consanguineous marriage helps the population for their survival after migration? For example, you see one migrant culturally minority community tries to survive or try to prohibit the cultural native dominant population through the cousin marriage. Because at least one cousin marriage helps the population to become contact, and a group of network has been established due to cousin marriage, either first cousin or second cousin. If there is no first cousin, there is a possibility of second cousin or third cousin. So one cousin marriage may help the population for their survival. And very recently, the prevalence of cousin marriage decreasing. They are already settled after migration, because in my population I saw that after migration, 350 years of migration, at least they are settled, and there is no possibility of cultural domination. So they are free from cultural domination now. But in previous 550 years ago or 100 years ago, they are cultural minority of the population. So is there any possibility that consanguineous marriage helps the population for their survival?
Yes, I think that's a plausible explanation actually. Especially what you see a lot of examples of this with when you have a minority community that has moved from outside to a new place. This example you were discussing of the community in West Bengal.
He's the person who
you were the person who was working there. Yeah, of course, it makes sense. But I'm thinking also, so any group that may have moved from outside, in the new environment, they may face discrimination, but they also may not know. In the new environment, people may face discrimination, but they also may not know, may not have the social connections to make outside marriages. Also, they may need to economically and culturally strengthen their group. So I'll give you one example. I don't know what you study about US demography or anything, but in the US, we have a famous population called the Amish people.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. They're famous in demography, so people may have heard, right? So this group, I have a student who is from a less conservative Amish community. He is doing postdoc now at Penn State with me, and he has population database he has made of like most of the Amish in the US. What you see in that community is they came from Europe. They were facing religious discrimination in Europe. They came to US. They want to live a very traditional lifestyle. So they are only endogamous, you have to marry only in that community, right? So in that endogamy, they have to marry cousins. So they would actually prefer to marry cousins, but they were sort of forced to. And then because of these genetic problems, at some point, they started trying to marry more distantly. But for a while, it was really kind of the norm because of just, it was the only possibility. They didn't want to mingle with the local communities because they wanted to keep their own lifestyle intact, right? So it could be because they are trying to segregate themselves, and it could be because they are trying to face discrimination from outside, or people not wanting to intermarry with them. But you're right, when the community becomes more established, the motivation is become calm, right? Why would you, at that point, you don't have to try anymore to keep yourself separate. This is kind of that argument of intensive, extensive kinship you can also think of in this way. In the intensive context, you may want to do this to strengthen the community, strengthen the hold on the land, keep the resources, the wealth in the community, etc. But if you have become established, it's better for your community if you can have some outside connections. So I think it's very consistent. It makes sense to me that they would first emphasize the cousin marriage if they were especially a migrant group. I don't know this literature so well, but you think about the people going from India and especially from northern Bangladesh, like Sylhet, Muslims going to the UK, also frequently marry cousins there, very commonly. More commonly than people marry cousins in Bangladesh. The cousin marriage custom is much higher among recently UK migrants from Bangladesh into the UK. If you are just someone living in Dhaka, you're probably an educated middle-class person living in Dhaka. The chances you will marry your cousins are only com. But if you are in some community trying to migrate to the UK through this kind of custom, then there'll be an emphasis on cousin marriage in a way that it won't be for the mainstream of kind of middle-class people in Bangladesh, where this is kind of not so common anymore.
There's a question in the chat box also.
Yeah.
Last one. Last one.
How does the financial state? She must answer first. Sorry.
I'll answer. So the question is, how does the financial status depend on non-cousin and consanguineous marriage, mentioned as marrying up and marrying down? I mentioned this briefly. We have this very interesting and very strong result that women who have more of the resources in the marriage belong to the wife than the husband are more likely to marry cousins. So the wife has more resources, and so she has married her cousin. We don't know for certain exactly what is going on, but one possibility, we have at least a little bit of ethnographic description, that is women who are inheriting some wealth, their parents in some cases may want to marry them to relatives to help them kind of protect the wealth and keep the wealth in the family. So their parents might want to see that, but also the other family members may want to try to keep that wealth in the family. In Bangladesh, we see this in cases where there are no sons and the daughters will inherit. Sometimes the cousins want to marry that daughter to keep the wealth in the family. But in a middle-class family, maybe they don't mind. But in a poor family that's afraid of losing their land, you may see this kind of motivation. Even though property motivations, for the most part, were not important, not very important, but in some cases, in some families, they were important. So I hope that answers your question.
I can only thank you for this fascinating lecture. I have a question. I was wondering how consanguinity is related with talaq or divorce. You have married, the person has married his cousin, and when the things when they separate, how the relationships actually between the two families actually get broken, and how they actually still maintain the relatives, relations, and other things. At the same time, the wealth that transferred from one family to another family within that kindred, how actually, I mean, how it takes shapes after the talaq or divorce. I mean, whether we have studied or not, I don't know, but you must have seen these things.
I'll give you the details from the Bangladesh side because, again, I have been working there for a long time and know this context well. So in the Bangladeshi context, most of the divorces are happening early in the marriage, first few months to 1 year. And so at that point, you may not have any children yet. So basically what will happen is the wife will go home to her parents. And then maybe after some time they'll try to persuade her to come back, etc. But at some point it's not possible, so she stays back. Or the husband just goes. The husband just leaves and goes to the city and he doesn't come back, or he comes back and she is kind of left there. So frequently, they are not actually formally divorcing. They stay legally married until one of them wants to get married again, and then they have to formally divorce. And then they'll have the divorce just the day before the new marriage. Because there's not a lot of motivation for poorer people, especially, to spend any money to go through this legal thing, especially if the marriage may get resolved. So they could be living apart for a long time, but they won't go through the formalities of divorce. So it kind of, for property, it depends on what happens. So if there's a lot of money that is transferred in dowry or something like that, it is often difficult to get that back, right? The wife's parents are probably in a situation where they can try. Maybe they'll manage to get some of it, but frequently they won't. Especially if the wife has left, right? But if the husband has left, maybe they'll manage a little bit better. But they often aren't in a position to do very much more than go and with some friends and try to grab some things and go back. But in the cases, but then you also have this other custom in Islam that I'm sure you're aware of, meher, mahorana, etc., right? So this is actually interesting, right? It's coming from the groom's side, it's settled on the bride, and this is, in case of divorce or something to help her maintain herself, is one of the ideas. Kintu, and this is true in South India, and it's also true in Bangladesh. In both cases, I have data on this, but we have too much data we haven't published yet. But sometime I'll have a student who will want to write this. That frequently, what's happening with the mahor is it is stated, it is in the book, the Qazi writes it, but it's not transferred. Or it's transferred over time, right? So basically, in the South India, in Bangalore area, they used to write 39 tolas would be the meher. But 39 tolas of gold is a huge amount of gold that no one can afford except really wealthy people. So that was just written. It was like symbolic. And so that wasn't really paid. But in Bangladesh, they'll write something that is more realistic. Not so kind of symbolic amount, but if the family is a very middle-class family and they're well-connected, and this is also true in my experience in India as well, they're well-connected and working outside, they'll pay the amount at the time of the wedding in the proper fashion, right? Because they can afford to do so. And so they are able to follow the custom very appropriately. But poor families frequently don't have much money, they can't afford to pay it, and so they write it, but it's not paid at the time, and frequently the wife says she has forgiven it, and so meaning she doesn't want it. Usually she forgives it later, right? So, or it goes a little bit over time. She gets some bangles at the wedding, and then after having a couple of for one child or something, she gets something else, etc. So slowly, he's giving her gifts, and these are part of the meher. So those cases, that should go with her if she leaves, And my impression is that it usually does, but the problem is most of the time it's not paid. So she doesn't have it to leave with. And so in that case, it's sort of kind of similar to the situation that Hindu women are in. They don't have anything, right? That the dowry has, which they're also paying dowry in Muslims in the whole subcontinent for a long time. Again, I have lots of data from different places. So it's sort of, in that case, it's very similar to the Hindu situation economically, where the money goes in one direction and the money doesn't come in the other direction except very slowly. Those are some thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Shenk. Just we have reached the last leg of our lecture and this process. So now is the time for summing up. I would like to request Professor Orbratan Bandyopadhyay to please come on stage and kindly summing the entire lecture for our visit. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shenk, and facilitated by Dr. Shashwata Ghosh to have Dr. Shenk with us. And it's really difficult to go with this summing up of this whole thing. But it's really interesting because before the lecture, I was talking to Dr. Shenk that we started on working on this consanguineous marriage, consanguinity here in University of Calcutta from 1992, and we have some kind of publication in 1994, 95, and 2011. So if you wish. Okay. Okay. Nothing to be mind because train will not wait for you. This is really interesting that the nuances that I got from your data and really the Bangladesh and India and what kind of work we did. I will definitely give you the reprints. We wanted to work on the Bengali population, the Shia and the Sunni Muslims. And the Sunni Muslims being mostly they are convertees. And Shias are not convertees. So we got some kind of different kind of inbreeding coefficients. Now I'm coming to the point of the consanguinity. So I feel that there are some kind of clarification should be there to my students that there will be endogamous versus the consanguinity. Endogamy doesn't mean the consanguinity. Because endogamy means within that group. For example, Shia will marriage to Shia. And for your community also, if you are Christian, then Catholic and the Protestant. So Catholic will be married to Catholic and the Protestant to Protestant. So this will be the endogamy. And if you come to the Hindu caste system, there will be tier of caste systems, hierarchical orders. And if it is not a caste system, for example, if it is a small population, it's quote unquote, I'm giving the tribal population. So they are also going to have their marriage within that group. So that is called endogamy. So consanguineous will be really if there is any blood relation. For example, what happened to the small population? Like hunting gathering group. And what I find that the hunting gathering group has a very low consanguinity. While in the agrarian there is higher consanguinity because of the labor distribution might be in condition. So this is really interesting part what you have said that what are the reasons behind it. So I think that should be a kind of going on the prospective measure. So if there is consanguinity, so what will be the effect that started with Subhendu's very really it's a biocultural. Okay. So I would like to go the best way to proceed is componentially component wise the biological and cultural. So effect is cultural because marriage is a social institution. This is the effect. And you talked about the transitions of the marriage. Yes, we have the transition of the marriage in the Hindu society is the intercaste marriage. So it is coming up, is hiring up because of the educational attainment, so many measures. And as a matter of fact, what happened in the case of the marriage is a human rights. It's not the animal thing, that you can go for the cages and all. So it's a human rights, but every society has its preferential system of marriage. You have just gone through with the South Indian hyper-vegetarian, but they are having some kind of uncle-niece marriage, and most probably they are the Nair population in South India, Nair population. So they have to, not all the South Indian population. And you believe that, I feel that everybody will believe that there is only taboo in the whole cross culturally is the incest taboo. That there is that every population having this incest taboo, because if you think about the consanguinity, so one part will be if you think as a random, and one part is if you think about associative mating, because in human there is no mating, it's marriage then mating. Okay, so associative mating. So extreme form of the associative mating should be the selfing, right? The same plant and the same, but in case of the human, it's not possible, and it's plausible that in case of the biological effect, there will be the homozygosity effects. So this homozygosity effects definitely make some kind of inborn error in genetic disease. Now, if it is miscarriage, that you are not going to get it expression, and it is a social stigma. You know, if you have a miscarriage, so that will not come up as a kind of data set until unless you go to the institutional delivery. So most of the time we are getting non-institutional delivery, so it's maybe masking off that you are not getting the fertility. And I get a very interesting results of that. I was looking very keenly that fertility rate of Pakistan is 3.6 and the India is 2.2 and the Bangladesh is 2.3 and the infant mortality is 62 in case of the Pakistan. So where the infant mortality will be high, fertility level will be high, because the people know that from their experiences that my child will not grow up to that, so we must have a kind of fertility that is high. So otherwise, I feel that this is a very interesting topic, because as an Indian scenario, there is very big group and a very low group, short groups. For example, if you think of a very short groups having small populations, what do? They will ultimately, after sometimes, they won't get their spouses. So I feel that polygamous points of view are very much important. Polyandrous or the polygamous, or what we call the polygyny. Now what will happen? That one father having multiple wives and their children. So father, one wife, multiple wife and children. Now the children are being more than first cousin, more than second cousin. What happens here? So in case of the Bangladesh, I believe that they are mostly the Sunni Muslims. Yeah, Pakistan are mostly the sect of the Shia Muslims. They have cultural differences. These people are celebrating the Muharram in Bangladesh, but Pakistan is not celebrating the Muharram because their sects are different. So we did work and we find really there is a plausibility of the homozygosity. I will give you the paper. We worked on the PTC testing ability, just a kind of trait. Just it's not deleterious trait. It's a kind of trait. And we worked on red cell H phosphatase. That's also the Mendelian inheritance, and we did polygenic inheritance in the dermatoglyphics, and we find fluctuating asymmetry, right? Intrauterine disturbances, fluctuating asymmetry in the dermatoglyphics. So my summing up is this: that it is a very interesting kind of work that we can do in anthropology with the cultural part and social part, because we have multi-ethnic group in India. So you can understand where the Islamic populations are more, there is a chance of consanguinity, what I was thinking about. And somebody asked about the twins. So really twins, actually, I will tell you one thing, just want to make a kind of observation and adding to your point that there are two kinds of twins. One is MZ twin, one is DZ twin. So what we find, the MZ twin almost equal in all population. And in case of the dizygotic twin, there is the effect of ethnicity, there is the effect of age and others. So you cannot say the twins as a whole with the consanguinity, right? So again, a twin may be a point of interesting point. However, what I find that there are mostly, I finish up my, maybe everybody is feeling bored. So you may make a hooter to me, because there's a problem to me that I'm taking the classes most of the time. So you overshadow other classes. Anyway, so I'm coming to the point that the last point, socialization does matter. Because why you are going to marry your cousin? So the socialization means, if you come up in the Hindu system, the socialization starts with the Raksha Bandhan, starts with the Bhai Phota. That's a point that has been making a point that you don't go for that kind of relationship.
Then what about Christian group?
Yeah.
They have Raksha Bandhan?
No. The Christians are not making the consanguinity.
That's what I'm saying.
No, I'm telling you, this is socialization. There is no. But the thing is, Christian are the industrial population. That's what he said. About the industrial population, consanguinity is not needed because of The thing is you don't need of the property and other kind of things. So this is really in Christianity, industrial population. So marriage is there, or the people are going for the living. And marriage is not there because you don't need a person that, okay, fine, I'm there, I need someone to live with me. Okay, so industrial Christian populations are most, and she has given an example of the Amish populations. Yes, this is if you go for a very, yes, very small population, Amish populations, and might be in the Amish population what we think that there is no concept of divorce too. That, yes, in the Amish population there is no concept of divorce, right? That Professor Bakchi was talking about the divorce. What happened? The Amish populations, they constitutionally do not have any kind of provision for divorce. So I am talking about, because this is the most interesting area I feel that in case of anthropology, because we can excel ourselves with the cultural, social cultural part of knowledge, and as well as biological prospective design. That if there is consanguinity, and you know this is the most important thing, because a marriage is a human right. You cannot say that you don't marry this person. So if you marry a consanguineous, you know that a kind of genetic trait is running in your family. So what to do? The thing is this, Javier, is the genetic counseling. Genetic counseling, because I know this kind of genetic background and I am closely related. So the genetic counseling, that part of the things are also included in the course of the anthropology in Calcutta University. So we always go, when I talk about this kind of things in the class, I always say that it is just a kind of non-directive. It's not eugenics. If you said that you cannot marry this one, so it was eugenics. But this is genetic counseling. That if you marry the cousin and you know a kind of genetic disorder running in your family on both sides, what will happen? So we will talk to you, and we have lots of things, because we can having the assessing the genetic risk and have a lot of powers in the experimentation. So we can give you some kind of directions that what you do. And I feel that this is a very thought-provoking part of the consanguinity kinship. That's the most important thing, because affinal kin and the consanguinal kin is the most important thing. If there is no kinship, then you are not really able to talk about the consanguinity. So, however, this is very much interesting. I feel that we, the people, the students who are very much interested with this kind of work, have a contact with Dr. Shenk. I feel that she will give her email ID, so all of the questions you can send over there. So I feel that will be a kind of collaborations that we can have. And if you wish, I can give my papers for that we started the work on from the 1990s. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Ratan for beautifully and gorgeously summing up the entire session. Now we are just, of course, thank you. So, just do you have, sir, your observation?
Any observation?
So first of all, I'll make Shobal response to a couple of points he made. One is that, there are a lot of Christian groups that have cousin marriage in the past, in different contexts, right? In traditional parts of Europe and things like that. But in the modern context, it's really gone away. It's really much less common. And I think it's because of the environment, the shift from agricultural to industrial is one of the major reasons for that. That was one point I wanted to make. I forgot the other point, but yes, I was also going to say, kinship is really foundational to human societies and of course to anthropology in general. So I think when I always think it's exciting to get back to these very foundational topics in anthropology by studying these kind of topics in a way that people that not everyone is doing. Okay. Thank you again very much for having me. I'm very interested with really good questions and conversations, and I'm sure we can have some more afterwards. Maybe I'll come back and visit also.
Thank you, Dr. Shenk, for the observations. And now we are the last, almost the last part of the program. So I'd like to request Dr. Shutapa Chaudhary for giving formal vote of thanks for the program.
Thank you, Shubhendu. I'm very happy today because Shubhendu asked me to deliver the vote of thanks to Dr. Shenk. This was a wonderful lecture, ma'am, and this is one of the lectures in the lecture series which we are having for some time, and we'll have many more like this. Dr. Shenk of Pennsylvania University has come here today to deliver this lecture, this wonderful lecture, very interesting and illuminating lecture. Thank you, ma'am, for coming here today. I also thank our distinguished guests present here online and in the auditorium, and all our faculty members of this department, scholars and students of anthropology and human rights. I also want to give special thank to Proloy Babu for his help every time you organize a program. Thank you all for making this program a grand success, and especially thank you, ma'am, so much from myself and from the department. Thank you.
Please join us for a cup of tea just outside itself.